Hey, Judge David Gooding held a hearing to begin deciding the girl's future.
I've never been in one day without him. It's very, very hard. Very hard. Yeah, I think about him every day.
Winslow, and said how much he misses his daughters. Haley's joining us now with this interview.
The morning of June 21st, 2013 felt like the beginning of something wonderful for an 8-year-old girl in Jacksonville, Florida. Cherish had one more sleep before she would board a plane to California, her first real trip to see her dad. She was so excited she could barely contain it. No one in her world, not her mother, not her sisters, not the neighbors who watched her zip around the block on her bike, had any idea that before that plane ever left the ground, Cherish Periwinkle would be gone forever. The girl behind the name. Her full name was Cherish Periwinkle. She was 8 years old. She lived in Jacksonville, Florida, a sprawling, humid city on the northeastern tip of the state, where strip malls and dollar stores sit between quiet residential streets and the wide, slow-moving street, Johns River. It was not a wealthy neighborhood. Life for many families there meant stretching every dollar, juggling work and childcare, and doing the best you could with what you had. Cherish's family was no different. But none of that dimmed who Cherish was as a person. Everyone who knew her used the same word, sweetheart. It wasn't a polite word people reach for when they don't know what else to say. It was the honest, immediate word that came out of the mouths of neighbors, family, friends, teachers, and relatives the moment her name came up. Cherish was genuinely, almost radiantly kind. She had a warmth that people noticed even in passing, the kind of child who made adults stop and smile without quite knowing why. She was silly, too. Cherish had a goofy sense of humor, always cracking jokes, always looking for the laugh. She was not a quiet, shy child sitting in the corner. She was in the middle of everything, animated and present, with her voice carrying across whatever room she was in. Her father, Billy, described her simply as the definition of pure love. That phrase, pure love, is the kind of thing a parent says when they are trying to put into words something that language can't quite hold. He said she had so much potential. He wasn't just saying it. You could see it in how she moved through the world, curious, engaged, caring. Her world, her habits, her joy. Cherish loved to draw animals. She would sit quietly with paper and pencils and fill pages with creatures, dogs, cats, horses, birds. For a child who was otherwise always in motion, drawing was her stillness. It was the thing that slowed her down and focused her. She also loved playing teacher. With her two younger sisters, 5-year-old Na and 6-year-old Destiny, Cherish would set up imaginary classrooms and take on the role of instructor with complete seriousness. She would line her sisters up, give them assignments, correct their answers. She was the oldest. She led, and her little sisters followed her, because that's what little sisters do when their big sister has that kind of energy. But the thing that had consumed her most, recently the thing she could not stop doing, was riding her bike. She had just learned. And like most children who crack that particular code, she was unstoppable. She would whiz around the block, around the driveway, through the neighborhood, hair flying, legs pumping, completely free. Being outside was her favorite place. Being outside with her sisters and her friends, moving, laughing, living, that was Cherish at her happiest. She was 8 years old. She weighed 67 pounds. She still had the round face of a young child, and when she smiled, which was often, it took over her entire expression. Her family. Cherish's home life was complicated in the way that many working-class families' lives are complicated. Not broken, not neglectful, just real. Her mother, Rain Periwinkle, was raising 3 daughters largely on her own. Rain loved her children fiercely. Neighbors and people who knew the family confirmed this. Rain was present. Rain was engaged. Rain always had her children with her. Cherish's father, Billy, lived in California. The distance between them was a source of ongoing legal and emotional tension. There had been custody arrangements, court orders, battles over time and access. It was the kind of slow, grinding family struggle that exhausts everyone involved. But through all of it, Cherish maintained a connection to her dad, and that connection was about to get stronger. The plan confirmed. ticketed, real, was for Cherish to fly to California the very next morning, June 22nd. She would finally spend real, extended time with Billy. This trip had been a long time coming. For Cherish, it was enormous. A plane ride, California, her dad. It was practically a fairy tale for an 8-year-old who had never been on a plane. She also had 2 younger sisters she adored, and an older half-sister named Lindsay, who was living in Australia at the time. The family was spread out, complicated, imperfect, but Cherish was the thread that seemed to run warmly through all of it. The eve of everything. The evening of June 21st was not supposed to be significant. It was just a Friday, the night before the big day. Rain needed to get Cherish a new dress for the trip. Something nice for the flight, for arriving at her dad's, for the photographs that would surely be taken. It was a practical errand wrapped inside a loving gesture. Money was tight. Rain later said she had been worrying openly about how she was going to pay for everything. The Dollar General store in Jacksonville was the kind of place you went when the budget was stretched thin, affordable, functional, no frills. Rain took all 3 girls, Cherish, Destiny, and Na, 4 of them, together, doing what families do on ordinary Friday evenings. None of them knew they were being watched. None of them knew that in that same store, at that same moment, a man was standing nearby, listening to Rain's worries, watching her daughters move through the aisles, and already calculating something that no decent human mind could conceive. Cherish held up dresses. She probably asked her mom which one was prettiest. She was hours away from the biggest trip of her young life. Her bike was at home. Her drawings were at home. Her stuffed animals were at home. And as the 4 of them walked out of that Dollar General store into the warm Florida evening, a stranger stepped forward, smiling, friendly, generous, and everything changed. What happened next would shatter a family, ignite a city, and force an entire state to ask how a man like this was ever allowed to walk free. There is a particular kind of danger that does not announce itself. It does not look like the monster from a nightmare. It does not arrive wearing a sign. It arrives smiling, offering help, speaking softly, looking you in the eye and saying you are safe. The most devastating predators in human history have understood this instinctively. They have weaponized normalcy. They have used kindness as camouflage. Donald James Smith had been doing exactly this for nearly 4 decades before he ever laid eyes on Cherish Periwinkle. Who was Donald James Smith? Donald James Smith was 56 years old in the summer of 2013. He was a heavy-set man with gray hair and an unremarkable appearance, the kind of face that blends into a crowd that you pass in a parking lot without a second glance. He drove a 1998 white Dodge van with curtains covering the windows. He had no stable employment, no meaningful community ties, no family structure that grounded him. What he did have was a criminal history so long, so consistent, and so deeply disturbing that it spanned 19 pages of documented records. 19 pages. That is not a person who made a mistake. That is not a person who stumbled. That is a person who spent the better part of his adult life cycling through arrests, convictions, jail time, and release over and over again, with a justice system repeatedly failing to stop him permanently. The beginning of a pattern. Donald's criminal behavior did not begin in adulthood. According to psychological assessments conducted later, Donald had begun engaging in voyeurism, secretly watching others at just 10 years old. 10. Whatever was happening in his inner world at that age was already being expressed through violation and secrecy. The seeds of what he would become were planted extraordinarily early. He claimed, in later conversations and assessments, that he had been abused himself. This is documented. Whether it fully explains the trajectory of his life is a question that psychologists, prosecutors, and the public have wrestled with. Abuse does not create predators automatically. Millions of survivors live full, non-violent lives. But in Donald's case, something went profoundly and permanently wrong, and it expressed itself outward toward the most vulnerable people he could find: children. Dr. Kino, a psychologist who assessed Donald, identified what she described as orbital frontal syndrome, a condition associated with hypersexuality, poor judgment, an inability to control inappropriate impulses, and a strong tendency toward reoffending. She said he struggled to control his impulses, though she was careful to note that struggle did not mean impossible. He was not legally insane. He knew what he was doing. He simply did not stop. A record that screamed a warning. In 1977, Donald was first convicted of assaulting a child under the age of 16. He was a young man then. That conviction should have been a warning flare. Instead, it became the first entry in what would grow into a nearly 4-decade criminal biography. In 1992, he was convicted of attempted kidnapping. The method was chillingly familiar. He had tried to lure 2 teenage girls into his van. A van. The same tactic. The same vehicle. 15 years after his first conviction, he was still doing the same thing, to the same demographic, using the same approach. The pattern was not evolving. It was locked in. Between 1992 and 2009, there were additional arrests and charges, a constellation of smaller crimes that painted the same picture over and over again. Florida's sex offender registry was created in 2007, and Donald James Smith was placed on it immediately. He was precisely the kind of person it was designed to track. Then in 2009, a case emerged that should have ended his freedom permanently. Donald had made obscene phone calls to a 10-year-old girl named Christina. But he had gone further than phone calls. He had impersonated a social worker from the Florida Department of Children and Families in an attempt to infiltrate Christina's family, to get close to her, to gain access, under a false identity and a fabricated authority. Christina's mother, Stephanie, later said with raw fury, "I wish he was dead. He's sick. They need to electrocute him. 3 weeks after you get out of jail, you've done it again and killed a child." Because Donald pleaded guilty to misdemeanor charges rather than felonies in that case, he served only 14 months. And because it was a misdemeanor, he did not meet the criteria required to be re-evaluated for civil commitment, the legal process by which the most dangerous sex offenders can be kept confined even after their sentence ends. That loophole cost Cherish Periwinkle her life. The system that failed. Here is what makes this case almost unbearable to examine closely. As far back as 1999, as Donald was preparing to leave prison, the state of Florida and multiple psychiatrists flagged him formally as someone highly likely to reoffend and remain dangerous. He was sent to a civil commitment facility near Tampa, a treatment center for sexually violent predators. The recommendation was clear: do not return this man to society until he is considered cured. But the jury that was supposed to hear the state's concerns and the psychiatrist's warnings never received that information. Somehow, in the machinery of a complicated legal process, that critical evidence never reached the people who needed to hear it. The jury did not know. And so, Donald walked. Daniel M. Faldi, the administrator of Florida's Sexually Violent Predator Program for the Department of Children and Families, later acknowledged that the statute was designed to identify that small, extremely dangerous number of predators. Donald Smith was in that 1% literally. Only 1% of all sex offenders received the civil commitment recommendation that Donald had received. And still, he was free. The weeks before, in late May 2013, Donald James Smith was released from jail. He had served his time for the misdemeanor charges. He was out. 21 days later, Cherish Periwinkle would be dead. In those 21 days, Donald did what was legally required of him. He met with police to verify his address, a state law requiring registered sex offenders to check in annually. He stood in front of officers. He confirmed his information. He was compliant, cooperative, unremarkable, and then he went back to his van. On June 21st, 2013, Donald James Smith drove to a Dollar General store in Jacksonville. According to his own later admissions, recorded secretly in jail, he had been drinking and using cocaine. He was, in his own words, coked up and drunk when he walked into that store. And that is when he saw her. A young mother, struggling openly, worrying aloud about money, surrounded by her 3 little girls. He watched, he listened, he calculated, and then he followed them outside. He had done this before: the van, the offer, the friendly face. But this time, the outcome would be different from anything that had come before. This time, there would be no escape. June 21st, 2013 was a Friday. In Jacksonville, Florida, the summer heat was thick and heavy, the kind that settles into concrete and asphalt and radiates back up at you long after the sun has moved on. It was early evening when Cherish Periwinkle gathered her 3 daughters, 8-year-old Cherish, 6-year-old Destiny, and 5-year-old Na, and headed to the Dollar General store. The errand was simple. Cherish needed a dress. Tomorrow morning, she was getting on a plane to California to see her dad. Rain wanted her to look nice. That was all this was supposed to be. Inside the Dollar General, Rain moved through the aisles with her girls, picking things up, checking prices, putting things back. She was stressed. Money was tight, and she said so, not quietly, not privately, but openly. The way people do when the weight of something is sitting heavy on them, and the words just come out. She spoke to a store employee about her worries. She picked up items and set them back down when the numbers didn't work. She had no idea anyone else was listening. Donald James Smith was in that store. He was watching. He was listening to every word. And when Rain and her daughters walked back out into the evening air, he followed them. The approach. What happened next was not impulsive. It was practiced. Donald James Smith had done versions of this before: the friendly approach, the generous offer, the manufactured trust. He walked up to Rain and her girls and introduced himself as Don. He was calm. He was smiling. He looked, by all outward appearances, like a harmless older man, someone's grandfather, perhaps. Someone safe. He told Rain he wanted to help. His wife, he said, had a gift card worth $150 at Walmart. They would drive Rain and the girls there. His wife would meet them, and together they would get the children whatever they needed. New clothes. A fresh start on a hard day. Rain hesitated. She said later that something felt slightly off, a flicker of unease that she could not quite name or justify. But Donald was good at this. He leaned into her hesitation with precision. He told her he understood how hard it was, that he had young children of his own once. He looked her directly in the eyes and said, "You are safe." Those words, spoken directly, deliberately, to a mother standing outside a dollar store with 3 little girls and no room in her budget for a dress. Rain got into the van. Cherish, Destiny, and Na climbed in with her. Inside Walmart. The 5 of them arrived at Walmart and began moving through the store. They browsed the clothing section. They looked at shoes. Cherish, being Cherish, was enthusiastic, moving, touching things, responding to everything around her, with the unfiltered energy of a child who finds the world endlessly interesting. Donald stayed with them. But the security cameras in Walmart, as Donald himself would later acknowledge in a jailhouse recording, has more cameras than a bank captured, something that Rain could not fully see in the moment. Donald was not simply accompanying the family. He was observing. He was tracking. Wherever Cherish went, he followed. He was paying her particular, focused attention in a way that never appeared on his face, but was visible from above, in the cold and impartial eye of the surveillance system. At one point, he tried to get Cherish to try on a pair of high-heeled women's shoes completely inappropriate for an 8-year-old child. Rain shut it down immediately. "No," she told him. "Those are not for her." Donald accepted the correction without visible reaction. Rain noticed, too, that the only item Donald placed in his own shopping cart during their entire time in the store was rope. She noticed. She felt uneasy. She told herself she was being paranoid. She looked around at the busy store, the fluorescent lights, the other shoppers, the cameras on the ceiling, and she told herself that nothing bad could happen here, in this public place, surrounded by all of this ordinary life. She was wrong. The moment. An hour and a half passed. It was now close to 10 o'clock at night. The children were exhausted. They had not eaten dinner. Donald's wife, the woman who was supposedly going to meet them with the gift card, had never appeared. Rain said she wanted to pay for what they had and leave. Donald insisted on buying everyone food from the McDonald's located at the front of the store. Walmart was beginning to close down around them. The announcement would come soon. Rain was distracted, managing two tired younger children, keeping track of everything at once, the way mothers of young children perpetually do. Donald mouthed across the store to Rain, "I'm going to McDonald's. What do you want to eat?" And then Cherish came bounding over to her mother. Could they get food? Could they please get food? She was hungry and excited and completely, heartbreakingly unafraid. Rain said yes. Cheeseburgers. She watched her daughter turn and skip. She actually skipped down the aisle toward Donald Smith as he walked toward the front of the store. That was the last time Rain Periwinkle ever saw her daughter alive. The discovery. Rain continued moving through the store with Destiny and Nay. Minutes passed. She started looking around for Cherish. She walked toward the front. The McDonald's inside Walmart was dark. It had been closed for some time already. Donald was nowhere. Cherish was nowhere. Then came the announcement over the intercom. Walmart was closing. Rain's unease cracked open into panic. She pulled out her phone to call the police. It wasn't working. She began running through the store, screaming, "Call 911. My daughter's been taken." She ran from person to person, aisle to aisle, her voice rising, her body moving, on pure adrenaline and terror. And for reasons that remain difficult to explain, no one around her seemed to respond with the urgency the moment demanded. People moved slowly. No one immediately acted. Approximately 40 minutes after Cherish disappeared, a Walmart employee finally gave Rain a working phone. She called 911. Her voice on that recording is the sound of a mother standing at the edge of an abyss. She told the operator everything: the man at Dollar General, the offer, the van, the wife who never came, the rope in the cart, the too much attention paid to Cherish, the dressing room visits, the women's shoes. She said, "I had a bad feeling. I thought I was just being paranoid. He was giving my 8-year-old too much attention." She said, "I don't want him to kill her. I should have told him no." The search begins. The first officers arrived at Walmart just 10 minutes after Rain's call ended. But the first several hours of the investigation were hampered by a critical misclassification. Police initially treated the case as a missing person situation rather than an abduction. Despite everything Rain had told them, despite the description of the man, the van, the rope, the vanished child, it would be more than 6 hours before an Amber Alert was issued. Walmart's cameras told the true story with devastating clarity. Footage showed Donald following Cherish through every section of the store. It showed them leaving together. It showed them getting into his white Dodge van in the parking lot. It showed the van pulling out past the security barriers and disappearing into the Jacksonville night. At 11:36 p.m., police broadcast a be on the lookout for Cherish and the van. By midnight, the alert had spread across Nassau County. An air unit was deployed. Officers swarmed the Dollar General and the Walmart. Motels and hotels were searched. Known sex offenders in the area had officers at their doors. At 3:30 inches the morning, they had a name: Donald James Smith, 56 years old, registered sex offender. The homicide detectives who were now running the case knew, statistically, what that meant for Cherish. Time was not on their side. It had not been on her side since the moment she skipped down that aisle. At 4 a.m., the Florida Department of Law Enforcement finally sent out the Amber Alert. Cherish had been gone for 6 hours. Somewhere in the darkness of a Jacksonville night, a white van sat behind a church, and beside a creek, beneath a tree, a little girl in a bright flowery dress had already run out of time. The morning after, Jacksonville woke up on June 22nd, 2013, to an Amber Alert and a city already holding its breath. The name Cherish Periwinkle was moving through neighborhoods, across television screens, and into the phones of people who had never met her, but immediately understood what was at stake. An 8-year-old girl, a white Dodge van, a man named Donald James Smith. The details were stark and frightening, and they spread with the particular urgency that missing child cases carry. The kind that makes every parent instinctively reach for their children. The investigation was now running on multiple tracks simultaneously. The child abduction response team had been activated. Homicide detectives were leading the case. The offender tracking unit was deployed. Air units swept the city from above. On the ground, officers were moving through motels, hotels, and the addresses of registered sex offenders in the surrounding area. Every resource available was in motion. But Cherish had been gone since the previous night, and everyone who understood these cases, who had worked them, who had studied the statistics, knew what that meant. The first hours after a child abduction are the most critical. They had already lost most of those hours to misclassification, delayed alerts, and the grinding machinery of a bureaucracy that had not moved fast enough when it mattered most. The tip that changed everything. At approximately 8:00 inches the morning, a phone call came in from someone who had been watching the news. They had seen a white van, the van parked behind a church in their area. The caller was nervous, uncertain, piecing together what they had seen with what they were now hearing on television. They described it parked far to the back, in a way that seemed deliberate, hidden. They weren't sure if anything had been left there. They didn't know. But they called. That call broke the case open. Officers immediately moved to the location. The van was gone by the time they arrived. Donald had moved it, but the location itself was now on their radar. And just before 9 a.m., officers caught up with Donald James Smith. His white Dodge van was located and surrounded. Officers drew their weapons. The commands were sharp and loud in the morning air. Driver, step out of the vehicle. Face away from us. Keep your hands in the air. Donald complied. He stepped out of the van. He was soaking wet. His clothes were damp in a way that had nothing to do with the morning heat. Scattered around him and inside the van were items he had purchased at Walmart the night before, the rope among them. Cherish was not there. Oh my God, she's in the water. K-9 officer Charles Wilkie was on the scene. He was a veteran, a man who had worked difficult cases, who had learned over the course of a long career to read crime scenes the way others read faces. He took one look at Donald Smith standing there, soaking wet in the morning light, and something locked into place in his mind with terrible certainty. He looked at Donald's wet clothes. He looked at the location. He thought about the creek behind the church, the same church near where the witness had spotted the van the night before. And Officer Wilkie said it out loud, loudly, to the officers around him. "Oh my God, she's in the water." Donald James Smith heard those words, and his reaction, the flicker that crossed his face in that moment, told everyone present everything they needed to know. He never said anything. He didn't have to. Officer Wilkie later described it. He never said anything, but just the look on his face kind of confirmed what the physical evidence was telling me. Officers moved immediately to the creek behind the church. 20 minutes after Donald Smith was placed in handcuffs, they found her. Cherish Periwinkle was lying on her left side near the water's edge, beneath a fallen tree. Her hair was hanging over the bank, floating in the water. Her bright, flowery dress, the kind of dress an 8-year-old wears on a summer evening when tomorrow is supposed to be the biggest day of her life, was near her body. She had been there through the night, alone, in the dark, while her mother ran through a Walmart screaming her name. The arrest and the interrogation. Donald James Smith was taken into custody and transported to an interrogation room where he sat alone for an hour. At one point during that hour, he appeared to fall asleep, a detail that spoke volumes about who he was and what he felt or did not feel in that moment. When investigators entered the room, they read him his rights. They told him they wanted to ask him about the abduction and murder of Cherish Periwinkle, 8 years old. They asked if he wanted to talk. He said no. He had no intention of cooperating. Not then. Not in that room. But Donald Smith, as investigators would soon discover, could not stop talking in other settings. In a secret recorded conversation with his mother in jail, he spent considerable time denying involvement, citing the very cameras he had stood beneath all evening as proof that he would never have attempted anything so foolish. "Walmart has more cameras than a bank," he told her. "It would be crazy to try anything like that." But as the conversation continued, pieces of the truth began surfacing. He admitted to being drunk and on cocaine when he had watched Rain trying to buy clothes in the Dollar General. He admitted to approaching them, offering the ride, driving them to Walmart. He described the evening in chaotic terms, claiming the children were out of control, that rain had been hitting them, that he had wanted to get away from all of them after just a few minutes, a claim the surveillance footage directly contradicted. His version of events involving Cherish was particularly grotesque in its construction. He claimed she had followed him. He claimed she had approached his van on her own. He claimed he was afraid of her, an 8-year-old, 67-pound child, and that he had panicked. He said he had driven around, trying to find someone to hand her off to. He said his mind had simply left him. Over and over, in broken, circular language, he repeated, "You've got to go. You have to go. I don't care how. You've got to go." He never admitted to the assault. He claimed he was not attracted to young children. But the evidence would tell a different story entirely. In 2 additional recorded conversations with fellow inmates, Donald was overheard discussing young girls with a casualness that turned the stomach of every investigator who heard the recordings. He described his specific age preference. He described Walmart as a hunting ground. The recordings were devastating and left no room for doubt about who Donald James Smith was. The trial. The trial of Donald James Smith began in early 2018, nearly 5 years after Cherish was killed. The delay had come from lengthy legal battles over Florida's death penalty law, appeals, processes, and procedural challenges. For Rain, for Billy, for everyone who had loved Cherish, those 5 years were 5 years of waiting for a justice that felt impossibly far away. The courtroom was charged from the first moment. The state opened with words that silenced the room. Cherish Periwinkle was 8 years old. She weighed 67 pounds. Separated from her mother, from her little sisters, from all she knew that was safe in this world, she spent the last petrifying hours of her life with him. Cherish did not die quickly, and she did not die easily. In fact, hers was a brutal and tortured death. You will be changed at the end of this trial. Rain Periwinkle took the stand as the state's first witness. She walked the jury through every moment: the Dollar General, the van, Walmart, the moment Cherish skipped away toward McDonald's. She described the last time she saw her daughter alive. When the prosecutor asked her directly, "Was that the last time you ever saw your daughter alive?" Rain answered with a single word: "Yes." Donald's defense team had initially planned to cross-examine Rain. They had a strategy built around suggesting she had made poor decisions, that getting into a stranger's van was a failure of parental judgment that bore some responsibility for what followed. But then, inexplicably, Donald himself intervened. He told his attorneys to stand down. He told them not to cross-examine Rain Periwinkle. His stated reason: she had been through enough. It was a rare and bizarre flash of something not remorse, investigators believed, but something more calculated. A performance, a gesture designed to appear human. The state called 12 witnesses on the opening day alone. Officer Charles Wilkie testified about the moment he identified where Cherish was. The witness who had spotted the van testified, and Dr. Valerie Ralph, who had performed Cherish's autopsy, took the stand to walk the jury through what had been done to this child. The injuries were so severe, so brutal, that Dr. Ralph, a medical professional who had performed countless autopsies, stopped mid-testimony and asked for a 5-minute break. The jury, watching and listening, were visibly shattered. Donald's defense team called no witnesses. They offered no closing argument. The verdict. On February 14th, 2018, Valentine's Day, after just 19 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned. Guilty. First-degree murder. Guilty. Kidnapping of a victim under 13. Guilty. Sexual battery of a person under 12 years of age. By special verdict, they found him guilty of both premeditated murder and felony murder, with kidnapping and sexual battery as the underlying felonies. 19 minutes. For a man whose criminal history ran 19 pages. 1 minute per page of documented destruction. During the sentencing phase, the jury heard from Karen, a woman who had been 13 years old when Donald had attempted to kidnap her. She described hiding, terrified, while he searched for her, calling out with cold fury. She had escaped. She had carried that trauma for decades. Her testimony showed the jury, with absolute clarity, that what happened to Cherish was not an isolated event. It was the inevitable destination of a path Donald had been walking his entire life. The jury voted unanimously. Death. The judge looked at Donald James Smith and said, "You have not only forfeited your right to live among us, you have forfeited your right to life at all. May God have mercy on your soul." In the gallery, Hain, Periwinkle, and Billy heard the words they had waited 5 years to hear. It was not enough. It could never be enough, but it was something. Billy said, "I just wish Cherish was here to see it." Justice had been delivered. But for the people who loved Cherish Periwinkle, the courtroom was just the beginning of a much longer road, one that had no real ending and no final destination that looked like peace. What remains? There is a particular kind of grief that does not follow the stages. It does not move from denial to acceptance in any orderly or predictable way. It circles. It ambushes. It arrives without warning on an ordinary Tuesday morning when you see a child on a bicycle, or hear a little girl laugh from somewhere down the street, or catch a glimpse of a flowery dress in a store window. For the people who loved Cherish Periwinkle, that grief did not end when the verdict was read or when the judge delivered his words. It moved with them. It lives with them still. This is what violent crime does to the people left behind. It does not just take one life. It fractures every life connected to that person quietly, persistently, across years and decades. Understanding the full weight of what Donald James Smith did on the night of June 21st, 2013, means following the threads outward into the years that came after and seeing what remained. Hain Periwinkle. Hain Periwinkle has carried the heaviest public burden of anyone connected to this case, and she has carried it while being judged by strangers who were not there, who do not know her, and who have appointed themselves authorities on her worth as a mother. In the immediate aftermath of Cherish's murder, Hain was unable to maintain stable employment. She said openly that she was repeatedly turned down for work once potential employers recognized her name, the mother whose daughter was taken. People blamed her. They did so publicly, loudly, and without mercy. She was grieving the violent murder of her 8-year-old child while simultaneously being held responsible for it by people who had never stood in her position, who had never been a struggling single mother approached by a practiced predator who looked her in the eyes and said, "You are safe." 6 weeks after Cherish's body was found, the state removed Destiny and Na from Hain's custody. What followed was a years-long legal battle that compounded her grief with a particular cruelty, the slow, bureaucratic loss of her remaining children while she was still raw from burying the first. Hain fought. She said she would never voluntarily terminate her parental rights. She said, "They are my children. I gave birth to them. I have raised them from day one." She briefly lost visitation rights, then had them restored, seeing her daughters for 2 supervised hours every Monday. She argued that she was not given a fair opportunity to prove herself. She argued that the system that had already failed Cherish was now failing her again in a different way. In 2017, after Hain had not completed the case plan requirements set out by the Department of Children and Families, the state placed Destiny and Na up for adoption. They were adopted by their Aunt Cherish's older half-sister Lindsay, who had been living in Australia and had been fighting through considerable legal and logistical obstacles to bring her sisters home. Hain was furious. She was devastated. She believed the process had been stacked against her, that her sister had not genuinely reconnected with the family out of love, but had pursued the adoption as a way of taking the children. She said she had not spoken to her sister in years. She said the last time she saw Destiny and Na was during a supervised visit, and that she told them she would never stop fighting. Whether Hain was failed by the system, failed herself, or some complicated combination of both is a question that does not have a clean answer. What is clear is that she lost Cherish to a predator, and then she lost Destiny and Na to a process. She has lived with both losses simultaneously, and she has done so largely without sympathy from a public that decided early on what kind of mother she was. Billy and Cherish's dad. Cherish's father, Billy, was in California waiting for his daughter to arrive when she was taken. He never got that visit. He never got any of the visits that were supposed to come after. Instead, he got a phone call, and then a funeral, and then 5 years of waiting for a trial. Billy's attorney said he personally believed Rain bore some criminal liability for what happened, a view the state ultimately did not pursue. Billy himself chose not to seek legal action against Rain. He said he was ready to try to move forward with his life as best he could. But moving forward from the murder of your child is not something that happens. It is something you simply survive, imperfectly, one day at a time. After the verdict, Billy stood outside the courthouse and said the words that every parent in that position eventually says, the words that acknowledge that justice, however real, is also hollow. It's not justice. He's been living for 5 years after the death of my daughter, and he's going to be living until the death penalty is either done or whatever the case may be. And that's not justice. She didn't get that option to live those many years. He was right. There is no sentence that restores what was taken. There is no courtroom outcome that puts Cherish back on her bicycle, or back at her drawing table, or back in front of her imaginary classroom with her little sisters lined up waiting for her to teach them something. Destiny and Dada. Destiny and Na Periwinkle, 6 and 5 years old when their sister was murdered, are now growing up in Australia. They were adopted by their aunt and her husband, and by all accounts, they are being raised in a stable, loving home. They lost their sister. They lost daily life with their mother. They lost the Jacksonville neighborhood where they grew up. They gained safety, consistency, and family. They are victims too, as Rain said in one of her public statements, and she was right about that, even if her other choices remained complicated and contested. These 2 little girls carry the weight of a night they were present for, a sister they will remember, and a childhood that was fractured by violence they did not choose and could not control. Whatever their lives look like now, that weight travels with them. Donald James Smith today. Donald James Smith sits on death row in Florida. His legal team has continued to fight his sentence through the appeals process. In 2021, the Florida Supreme Court unanimously upheld his conviction, ruling that the evidence of his guilt was overwhelming, a characterization that required no elaboration for anyone who had followed the case. Then in 2023, nearly a decade after Cherish was murdered, Donald's new attorneys brought his case back into a Duval County courtroom. They argued that his original trial lawyers had been ineffective, that they had failed to remove a potentially biased juror, and had not followed proper procedures during jury selection. They argued that a juror had initially answered yes on a questionnaire when asked whether she had already formed an opinion about Smith's guilt, then crossed out the answer and written no. His original attorneys had noticed but had not pursued it further, deciding she seemed like a reasonable juror. Rain Periwinkle sat in that courtroom and watched Donald Smith enter the room. Nearly 10 years after the night that destroyed her family, she sat and watched the legal system continue to turn its wheels around the man who had taken her daughter. The outcome of those proceedings continues to work through the courts. Donald James Smith remains on death row. He remains alive. He continues to exist in a way that Cherish does not and never will again. What this case reveals: the case of Cherish Periwinkle is not simply a story about one monstrous man and one devastating night. It is a story about systems, the gaps within them, the failures compounded across decades, the moments where a different decision by a different person might have changed everything. Donald James Smith was flagged as dangerous in 1999. Psychiatrists said so. The state said so. The recommendation for civil commitment was made formally and clearly. The jury that should have heard those concerns never did. A legal process designed to protect the public from the most dangerous predators among us failed at a critical junction. And 14 years later, Cherish Periwinkle paid the price. The 2009 case involving Christina, the 10-year-old girl Donald had called, and the family he had tried to infiltrate while impersonating a social worker, should have triggered a felony charge. It did not. Because it remained a misdemeanor, Donald did not meet the criteria for reevaluation. Another junction, another gap, another moment where a different outcome was possible. Rain's decision to get into the van has been examined, criticized, and debated endlessly. But what receives less examination is why a registered sex offender with a 19-page criminal history was free to drive a van through Jacksonville in the first place. The predator who targeted her family was not a stranger to the authorities. He was a known quantity. He had been flagged, documented, registered, tracked, and repeatedly released. The system knew who he was. The community did not. Rain said it herself, standing outside the courthouse after the verdict. He was let out for 21 days before he did this. The police knew who he was. We as a community did not know who he was. Cherish's law legislation pushed for in Florida, in the aftermath of the case, sought to strengthen the monitoring and civil commitment processes for violent sexual predators, to close the gaps that had allowed someone like Donald Smith to cycle through the system so many times without permanent consequence. Whether those changes have been fully implemented and whether they are sufficient remains an ongoing conversation. Final tribute. Cherish Periwinkle loved drawing animals. She would sit quietly with her paper and pencils and make creatures come to life on the page. She loved playing teacher with her little sisters, lining them up, giving them assignments, being the oldest, being the leader, being the one they looked to. She had just learned to ride her bike and could not be stopped. She was outside every chance she got, moving through the world with the complete and uncomplicated joy of a child who has not yet been taught to be afraid of it. She was caring. She was silly. She cracked jokes. She made adults smile without trying. Her father called her the definition of pure love, and everyone who knew her seemed to agree, in the way people only agree when something is genuinely true. She was 8 years old. She weighed 67 pounds. She was one sleep away from her first plane ride. She actually skipped down an aisle in a Walmart on a Friday night, following a man she thought was getting her a cheeseburger, completely unafraid, completely herself, completely alive. She did not deserve what happened to her. No explanation makes it bearable. No sentence makes it right. No amount of time makes it smaller. The world she would have grown into, the drawings she would have made, the students she might have taught one day, the bicycle rides she would have taken, the life she would have built existed only in potential. And that potential was stolen from her on a summer night in Jacksonville by a man the system should never have allowed to be free. Her name was Cherish Periwinkle. She was 8 years old. She deserved every single year that was taken from her. She deserved California, and her dad, and her bike, and her sisters, and every ordinary, magnificent, unremarkable day that should have followed. Cherish, you were so much more than what happened to you. The world is immeasurably less bright without you in it. We remember you.